Hello, welcome to Buying Abroad. My name is John Howell. I'm a lawyer. I'm a partner in the International Law Partnership, and I've been dealing with international property transactions now for 25 years. This seminar is all about the critical question of who should own the property that you're thinking of buying abroad. And it's a topic about which I speak, and I'm asked to speak many, many times. I can't stress enough just how important it is to get the question of ownership right. It's important for three main reasons. First of all, if you put the property in the wrong names, you will pay a huge amount too much tax. Not a little amount, absolutely masses too much tax during your lifetime and on your death. Secondly, there are many countries in the world which restrict the freedom that we take for granted to leave your property as you please when you die. And if you buy the property in the wrong name in one of those countries, then when you die, the wrong relatives will have the right to inherit. And that can be a disaster in a number of different ways. And the third reason is that it is always expensive to correct it if you get it wrong at the beginning. So the reorganization will be treated as a gift, and that gift will generally carry tax and legal expenses. And in the worst case, the tax and the legal expenses can amount to nearly 90% of the value transferred. So it just doesn't make sense to think that we will put the property in my name for now and sort out the details later on. You need to decide who is going to own the property before you sign the title deed, at the very, very latest. And preferably, you need to decide who is going to own the property before you sign any paperwork at all. The reason I say that is in the last 3 or 4 years, we've seen an increasing number of cases where people have come to see us after they've already signed a contract to buy a house. Possibly they've signed the contract in their joint names, Mr. and Mrs. Smith. And when we sit them down and talk about it, it's quite obvious that that is a crazy way of buying in their particular circumstances. And so we then phone the developer and we say, I've just seen Mr. and Mrs. Smith. They're very happy to be buying a house from you. Don't think there are any great problems. Just one small thing. They're going to buy this in the name of a company or their children instead of in their own name. And the developer can then turn around and say, well, that's absolutely fine by me, but do remember that these people have a contract with me, and if they now want to change it, the price is going to go up. Now, of course, what the developer is really doing there is he's saying, I know that the reason you're telling the clients to change this is because it's going to save them a lot of money, and therefore, if there's some money to be had, I want my share of it. Now, that's fortunately still not a common problem, but it is increasingly common, and we therefore suggest that you should get this sorted out right at the beginning before you even go looking at properties, so that by the time you go on your trip, you know what you're going to do if you find a property that you really like. And the choice is not obvious. Just because it is you and your husband or you and your wife who are buying the property does not mean that it's best to put it in your joint names. Putting it in some other name could save you a great deal of money. And I find it difficult sometimes to get across to people just how much money you can save. Well, one example. I was dealing with the sale of a property in Croatia recently, and the lady who was buying it was going to put it in her name alone. That was not a good idea. We discussed it with her, she changed her mind, and on a £200,000 house, we saved her £80,000 in taxes on her death and during her lifetime. Now that is a lot of money for the sake of maybe 30 minutes talking about the issue. There are lots of options as to whose name you might want to put the property into, and the important thing to understand is that for each of you, only one of those options will be right. Another one might be barely acceptable, and the rest are a complete and utter waste of time and money. And as I said before, the right option is not obvious. There are so many options, I'm just going to run through a number of them today. One of them is to buy in your name alone. That is to say, if you and your wife are buying a property, you put it just in your name or just in her name. And there can be very good reasons for doing that. It may be, for example, that your wife runs a business that's in financial difficulty, in which case you might want to put the property in your name to protect that asset if her business goes down the tubes. Or if you're 92 and your wife's 18, probably a good idea to put it in her name, unless you think she's going to run away with the milkman as soon as she's got her hands on your assets. Because the odds are she will survive you by many, many years, and therefore you will defer by many years the date when any tax has to be paid. Another good reason for doing it is tax planning. Sometimes it will be better for you to own just in her name, because she may be a low-rate taxpayer and you're a high-rate taxpayer. But normally it is not a good idea to buy just in one name. Normally, overall, it's more expensive than it is if you buy in several names. Another option is to put your wife on the title, in which case you have to understand that the effect is very different from doing so in this country. In this country, if you and your wife buy a house together, it's normally on the basis that it's organised in such a way that when you die, your wife automatically inherits your half share, and she does so tax-free. Not so abroad. Normally, your half is your half, hers is hers. When you die, your half is left in your will, and if you leave it to your wife, then she will normally have to pay tax on that inheritance. What about adding your children to the title? If you give them part of the money now, then when you die, they won't inherit that part, and so there will be no tax to pay. If you give it them and you survive for 7 years, there'll be no tax in the UK, providing you steer clear of something called gifts with reservation of benefit. And from the foreigner's point of view, they have always owned the property, so there'll be no tax in the country where the property is located either. Can save you a lot of money. And if that sounds interesting, what about putting it just in the children's name alone? That way, when you die, they don't pay any tax at all on the inheritance of that property. And if you're otherwise paying 40% inheritance tax in the UK, £200,000 house, that's £80,000 tax saved. It's not, of course, as simple as that. There is a downside. If you give the property to the children, it is then their property. And if you fall out with them, and yes, it does happen, they can stop you using what you think of as being your property. If they get divorced, then their husband or wife may make a claim against the property. And worse still, they can sometimes be so inconsiderate that they will die before you and leave you to inherit your own house back and pay inheritance tax for the privilege. If you're going to do it, you might want to put a life interest so that they have the ownership, but you have the right to use it during your lifetime. But in the best of cases, it can be a very tax-efficient way of owning the property. Similarly, if you want to give your property when you die to a stranger, not to your children, someone to whom you're not related, it can make sense to do it now because it can be much, much cheaper in tax terms when you die. Sometimes overseas, inheritance tax rates to gifts to people you're not related to can be very, very expensive. So giving to them now can be a very tax-efficient thing to do. If you're going to do this, give property now to avoid tax later, you need to structure it right, because if you give them the property, that can be worse than leaving it them by way of inheritance, because generally the tax level you pay on a gift is going to be more than the tax level you would pay on an inheritance. And what that means is you need to get it right. You need to make sure that the gift is made in this country, that you give them the money, not the asset itself. Some people will choose to own their property through a limited company. In some countries, that's a legal requirement. You're not permitted as a foreigner to own in any other way. That includes, for example, the Czech Republic and certain types of property in Bulgaria. But it's usually not a requirement that you own through a company, and so if you choose to do so, it's because you think it's going to give you some tax or other advantages. And it can be very tax efficient, because a company is taxed in a different way from a private individual, and as a result, you may find, particularly if you own a number of properties, that you will pay less tax than would otherwise be the case. Or you may find that only by owning through a company, for example, are you allowed to rent the property out. If you're going to own through a limited company, then you've got a number of choices. It can either be a local company based in the country where the property is located, or a UK company, or another EU company, or an offshore tax haven company. You need to get the right choice here because, again, by choosing the right type of company, you'll save a great deal of money. Some people will own through a trust. A trust is basically a tax fiddle, but entirely legal. It is a system whereby you give away your assets to somebody called a trustee. They hold them on your behalf, but they're not yours for legal purposes. This is a lot more complicated. It's very, very useful for some people and not just the very rich, but it's certainly not for everybody. Some people will choose to own through a SIP, a self-invested personal pension, and this can give you massive tax advantages even for ordinary people. The plan for SIPs was pretty straightforward. It's self-invested. You choose what to invest in, you choose when to invest. It's regulated by the Financial Services Authority, and it is relatively low cost, so the expenses don't need to put you off. The key features of the SIP, well, if you're buying property, the money you spend is tax deductible. It's completely tax-free in the UK for income and capital gains tax purposes, and you can pass it on in your will. I'm going to be looking more at SIPs in the second part of the show, and also at other ways in which you might choose to own your property overseas. Until later. Welcome back. We're bringing you the facts about investing in property abroad, and in this seminar we're talking in particular about how important it is to make sure that you put the right names on your title deeds. And just before the break I was talking about how it can be a good idea to own through your pension fund, your self-invested personal pension, otherwise known as a SIP. Why is it such a good idea? Well, basically it gives you some incredible tax breaks. The money that you use to buy the property is a tax-deductible expense, and the income and capital gains that the property makes will be tax-free, and it will be outside the scope of UK inheritance tax. The net effect of all that can be to double the return on your investment. So what can you invest in? Well, a SIP can invest in commercial property. Bars, restaurants, hotels, condo hotels, and so on. And if you choose to make that sort of investment, then you can own what's called directly. In other words, the SIP can own that property in its own name. Or, if you prefer, you can own it through an investment fund. What you can't do is invest in residential property, apartments or houses, directly. That isn't allowed. The Chancellor took that away from you a year or so ago. You can have indirect investments in your SIP in residential property, providing they're not what's called a close proxy for direct investments. In other words, you can't have the property owned by a company and have your SIP own 100% of the shares in that company. What we can do is set up something called a genuinely diverse commercial vehicle. And basically that is a company that owns a number of properties, and you own no more than 10% of the shares in that company. Those shares are owned in the name of your SIP, and the others belong to other people or other SIPs completely independent from you. Or again, you can own residential property through an investment fund. Another of the options we mentioned earlier was owning through an investment club. I think these are a great idea for many small investors. The basic idea is that you get together with a number of other people, up to 20, most of the ones we deal with are 12 or 15, and instead of you owning one apartment, say for £50,000 in Bulgaria, you have 15 people, each with £50,000 in the deal, and you then have 750,000, which you have divided amongst 8 or 9 properties around the world. Very, very efficient, very diverse, very low risk as property investments go. Very cheap to set up and run, and great fun, because the people doing this enjoy what they're doing and enjoy taking an active part in the management of their investment. You still have to find the best property, and you have to design a tax-efficient way of owning it, and you may find you need a dating agency because you may not have friends who want to do this with you, and in which case we can help find others of a like mind. Well, which of those ways of owning is going to be best for you? There is no one-size-fits-all for this. What's right for you will depend upon a whole range of things, your age, your experience, etc. And you need to think carefully about this, because making the right choice will save you loads and loads of money. You need to take into account particularly your age, your family situation, and your proposed use of the property. You need to take into account your UK tax position and what you can do to minimise the tax obligations in this country. You need to take into account your tax situation in the country where the property is located, so as to minimise your obligations there. And very often what we need to do is keep on going round the loop until we find a solution that works both in the country where the property is located and also in this country. You'll need to think about a will. What do you want to happen to the property when you die? And of course, there is no point in coming up with an ownership solution which is so expensive it costs more than the amount of the tax you're going to save. I've mentioned investment funds. There are various types of fund, but they all share the same objective. Instead of you owning your own property, you put money into what boils down to a company, and that company owns property. It buys and sells and rents out property, and then you, with the other investors, share the benefit of that profit. So basically, buying into a property investment fund is like buying into Tesco's, but instead of them selling groceries, they buy and sell properties. Not a great deal of fun, because you have no hands-on involvement in ownership of a property through an investment fund. You don't decide which properties to buy, you don't decide when to buy or when to sell, but it is painless. One of the investment funds is a REIT, a real estate investment trust. This is an American concept, now very much in favour with the Chancellor, and was launched in this country in January 2007. It's a special investment structure, but it sells very much in the same way as shares in a company would sell. It's professionally managed, professionally controlled. It does have limitations. No one person can own more than 10% of the shares in the company, and it has limits to the amount that it can borrow, because the Chancellor doesn't want you to have too much borrowing in this type of investment. There are, however, some great tax breaks. The company itself is free of taxes in this country, in most cases, and if you choose to put your existing assets into a REIT and then carry forward on that basis, the amount of tax you will have to pay when transferring those assets in is very low indeed. For the investor in the REIT, then you will have to pay your own normal taxes on the income and gains that you make from it. If the investor in the REIT is itself a pension fund, your self-invested personal pension, then that fund pays no tax in the UK, and therefore the REIT becomes effectively a tax-free investment. Now, of course, there are limitations on owning through a REIT, and one of them is the risk of management charges. There are going to be some management charges, but in some cases they seem to be quite high, and if you're not careful, that can make serious inroads into the profit you're going to make. Even without high management charges, you're probably going to find the rates of return on a REIT are likely to be lower than you would manage yourself if you invested well and managed the property well. Another option is the property unit trust. Very similar in concept to a REIT, just a different legal mechanism for achieving the same result of allowing a group of people to band together to invest in property. It's a collective investment scheme like any other unit trust. The unit trust buys and sells and rents out money to make profit, and that is held on trust, and that then gives you the benefit of the profit that it's made. Now, none of this is simple. That's probably obvious from what I've been saying. Giving this advice to a client typically takes 30 or 40 minutes because you need to know quite a lot about them before you can effectively give the advice. Be aware that many lawyers overseas do not even think about this issue. You walk in as Mr. and Mrs. Smith, they will simply say, right, Mr. and Mrs. Smith, you are buying a house, and proceed down that path without thinking about whether there might be a better, more appropriate, cheaper ownership structure for you. Now, finally, I want to tell you two stories, both relating to clients who were buying property abroad, both of whom saved a lot of money by the use of appropriate ownership vehicles. The first lady was buying a house in Croatia, and she had decided to buy this property just in her name, and she then came to see us, and it became obvious that the person who had been dealing with her in Croatia had not told her that in order to rent out her property in Croatia, certainly at that time, you needed to buy through a limited company. You were not allowed to own in your own name. Another lady, also buying in Croatia, decided to buy in her own name, and nobody had told her that because she was unmarried and it was going to be distant relatives who inherited her assets, there would be a high level of taxation to pay. Again, by changing the name, we saved a large amount of money. And that's what it's all about, making sure the property's in the right name. Well, that's about it. Just to remind you, this seminar is not a substitute for proper legal advice. It's brief, it has to be, it can't take account of your personal circumstances, and worse still, the law changes all of the time, so that by the time you hear it, it may be out of date. If you want to find out more, if you'd like to contact me or see some of the other materials we've prepared, contact the website www.realestatetv.tv. There's a free copy of this presentation to download, as well as various other materials that we've prepared. Thank you. I hope you've enjoyed the seminar. Goodbye.